I'm grateful for only one thing about my husband. That I got married and met my mother-in-law. That's it. To me, she was the ideal woman. On the other hand, my father-in-law is terrible. He shows up at our rented apartment, where my husband, Kevin, and I live, and just rants and raves. He's a chauvinist, a strong believer in male superiority, and says things like, "Still no grandchildren? It must be because you're defective. Do your duty as a wife properly." His demands for a grandchild were harsh, and I was constantly berated as a worthless wife. My husband just turns a blind eye, and when I confront him later, he makes selfish excuses like, "Dad will nag me for being a henpecked husband if I defend you." Ignoring such a husband, it was my mother-in-law who protected me, saying, "Children are a blessing." Even when unfairly blamed by my father-in-law, who'd say, "It's because of your poor upbringing that Kevin turned out to be useless, just like you who could only have him." She would just smile and say, "It's okay. I just wanted my mother-in-law to be happy." But then, one day, she had a stroke, and was left with numbness in her left arm and leg. I suggested hiring a caregiver, but my father-in-law's response was cold. "If we do that, it'll seem like we're treating my wife as a burden. Plus, I'm not wasting money on her. If you feel sorry, you, as her daughter-in-law, should take care of her." Stunned by his callous words, I met Kevin's eyes, and he awkwardly asked me to quit my job and take care of his mother full-time, since Dad says so, and I'll help too. They are his parents, and I can't believe he is just going to help me. It was so irresponsible and a statement that relied on me, the daughter-in-law, from the beginning, but I absolutely did not want to just give my mother-in-law a hard time. So, I finished up my work, resigned from my job, and began the daily routine of commuting between my in-laws and my own home. Every time I did something, my mother-in-law would say, "Thank you," seemingly uncomfortable with how her husband treated me like a maid. He'd throw food away, saying, "I can't eat this terrible meal. Dog food might be better," and when mail piled up, he'd call me over to scold me, yelling, "Managing the mail is the wife's job. Letting it pile up shows how sloppy you are." My husband, who started a consulting firm, used his irregular work hours as an excuse to ignore his mother's situation, saying, "I'm busy with work. Don't bother me." Despite the caregiving burden, the time I spent with my mother-in-law was my only solace. We talked about many things. Her upbringing, how she met her husband, the struggles of married life. "We're quite alike," she'd say, confiding in me her secrets. It was then I realized she wasn't just kind, but also wise and shrewd. Sadly, a year after her caregiving started, she passed away. After the funeral, a lawyer, the executor of her will, visited, along with her family. Kevin wondered why relatives like her grandfather and uncle, who weren't directly involved in the inheritance, are here. But the lawyer explained it was all her wish, and announced a tape recording would be played. As soon as I heard her voice, I was moved to tears. But I was shocked by her words. "I want to leave all my inheritance to my son's wife, Catherine. That's my honest wish." "Why?" As if seeing through my surprise, her voice explained why she refused to leave the inheritance to her husband or son. "When I became partially paralyzed and life became difficult, my husband dismissed the idea of a caregiver, ignoring Catherine's pleas. My father-in-law, who treats me like a housekeeper and yells at me constantly. My husband, who never fulfilled his promise to help and never even came to check on my mother-in-law." My mother-in-law, in tears, said she was so sorry that I had to deal with these two people in addition to taking care of her own needs. "You have to free Catherine from this hell." But I was so happy to spend time with her, I couldn't spare her, and in the end I couldn't let her go. The tape stops with the voice of my mother-in-law apologizing. I could not stop my tears from welling up. Sister of my mother-in-law quickly offered me a white handkerchief and I looked up to see her and opened my mouth to say something to her tearful face, "Thank you." That's when I heard, "You are a horrible man." I huffed at the sound of an angry voice and something slamming, and looked to see my mother-in-law's brother riding up to my father-in-law and grabbing him by the chest. Her family, unlike mine, was full of kind, family-oriented people. My mother-in-law's mother is gone, but her father is alive and well, crying with regret. Why didn't he come to me for help? I had the same question as him and had asked my mother-in-law before she died. I'm married into another family. It wouldn't look good for a woman from a wealthy family to rely on her parents. To my surprise, she said, but now, I'm glad I endured. Because I got to meet you, Catherine. It's not like that. I merely entrusted everything to my daughter-in-law, that's all. My harsh words to her were just a way of disciplining her. My father-in-law's trembling voice interrupted, and his disturbing noise seemed to tarnish the memory of my mother-in-law. With wet cheeks, I stood up. My mother-in-law always protected me, both before and after she fell ill. When her food was rudely thrown away by you, she'd help me pick it up, saying her hand still worked. I don't want to hear a single word from you, father-in-law, that contradicts what my mother-in-law said. I couldn't say more, as tears welled up again. Playing the tragic victim, huh? But weren't you really after Mom's wealth from the start? My husband sneered mockingly. Dad, you know there's something called a reserved portion, right? No matter how much Mom wanted to leave everything to Catherine, half of it is supposed to be ours, he said confidently. My father-in-law seemed reassured by his son's words. Ladies and gentlemen, the will tape is not yet finished. Please return to your seats. The lawyer interjected, carefully resetting the atmosphere. I was certain of it. This should not be the only surprise left by my mother-in-law. The first words of the next tape were as I expected. Now, I should have mentioned this earlier, but I have divorced my husband, Tom. Divorce from my father-in-law. I was thrilled at the wisdom of my mother-in-law to play this trump card here. People gasped in shock, and my father-in-law's eyes widened in disbelief. My mother-in-law had anticipated her son pointing out the reserved portion and legally sever ties with her husband by going through the divorce proceedings. A divorce? Impossible. When did this? My father-in-law stammered in confusion. I handed him an envelope. A divorce notice? I helped my mother-in-law to file it, I explained. What? He exclaimed. He nearly grabbed my collar, but my mother-in-law's brother protected me. You mentioned you want divorce at first. You said if she had the audacity to rely on her brothers while being married to a man who graciously would a frail woman like her, she should start divorce procedure. My father-in-law, jealous of his brother-in-law's wealth and unable to oppose him due to financial dependence. He satisfied his petty pride by being hard on his sister, his mother-in-law. I was scolded for not managing the mailbox, so I took care of the divorce notice as well. I wanted to report it, but whenever I tried, I was yelled at to be quiet, so I followed instructions, I said. That's no excuse, he yelled, red-faced. But I was praised by my mother-in-law's family, all saying, well done. With clenched teeth, my father-in-law turned to his son, Kevin. This can be fixed, right? However, Kevin only laughed dismissively, sorry, but there's nothing to be done. With my father-in-law's inheritance rights gone, Kevin could claim half of my mother-in-law's wealth as his reserved portion. That's impossible. My father-in-law collapsed, powerless. The rest of the will tape didn't mention any way to deprive Kevin of his share. My mother-in-law's final words on the tape were a plea to her family to look after me. The handwritten will also states the same. The lawyer added. Eventually, my father-in-law was forced out of the house. It was originally a property given to my mother-in-law by her father before marriage, and she had transferred ownership to her brother to prevent any trouble after her death. Desperate, my father-in-law ended up moving into Kevin's apartment. As for me, I had already divorced Kevin and left the apartment. I had planned to divorce anyway, but the will tape served as evidence of mistreatment, and Kevin, caring about public image, paid the requested alimony, finalizing the divorce smoothly. The financial support for my father-in-law's restaurant was cut off, and he was left scrambling for funds. Perhaps he was overworked, but it was only 3 months after I left home that my ex-husband informed me that my father-in-law had collapsed. Ironically, he had suffered the same stroke as my mother-in-law and was left paralyzed from the lower half of his body. When Kevin shamelessly asked me to care for his father, I advised him to hire a caregiver, to which he retorted angrily, "Are you stupid? Putting him in a facility would look bad. He's my real father, don't you have any sympathy as his former daughter-in-law?" I don't have an ounce of sympathy. If he's your real father, why don't you take care of him yourself? I snapped back, hanging up in anger. My father-in-law never had a word of gratitude for me. I wondered how it would turn out with his son, and sure enough, within a week, my ex-husband called. Apparently, he had resorted to hiring a caregiver, but my father-in-law, always finding faults and yelling, scared them all away. If I told him I would put her in a facility, he would tell my ex-husband, "You're treating me like a nuisance," and throws things at him. My ex-husband's desperate voice reached out, but I didn't deal with it and ended the call. I eventually changed my phone number because of his persistent calls. I regretted not doing it sooner. Then, as I resumed work and enjoyed my peaceful life, it was my mother-in-law's sister who updated me on my ex-husband's situation. He had the audacity to approach my mother-in-law's family for help with his father's care. His shamelessness, asking them to care for his father and not having taken care of my mother-in-law, disgusted them. Both my mother-in-law's father and brother, realizing he was a man who only thought of himself, cut ties with him completely. Most of my ex-husband's consulting firm's clients were referrals from her brother, and with contracts being terminated one after another, even pouring my mother-in-law's inheritance into it wasn't enough. Eventually, his company went bankrupt. Both father and son fell from grace, unable to pay rent and evicted from their apartment. Without funds for a caregiver, they probably live a miserable life in a cheap apartment, enduring my father-in-law's angry outbursts. My mother-in-law, who once laughed about making them regret their actions one day, would have been pleased. Just as planned. Yes, I could see her smiling evilly.